Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it is June 14th, 2026, and we are here to talk about the world, current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
There we go.
Welcome. People didn't put enough Agent Smith emotes, so your mic didn't work at first. But we can hear you loud and clear. How have you been, Agent Smith? We had a week or two off where I was on a trip. We drove from South Dakota to the Oregon coast, stayed for a week, and then came back.
Nice. Yeah, you went crabbing, right?
Yeah.
How did it go?
We cooked big time. We timed it right so it was slack tide, which is the transition between tides, like low tide and high tide, or vice versa. And that's when the crab tend to be the most active in moving around. And they're also more active when it rains. So it rained a little bit as well. So the conditions were pretty much perfect. It's not the best season to go crabbing, but all the other conditions were pretty much optimal. And we were out there with maybe 4 other vessels that were trying to crab in the same area. And they didn't catch any crab at all. Guess how many we caught?
How many did you catch?
23.
Is that high?
That's a lot more than 0, I'll tell you that.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it was good. Very good haul. I think we got maybe 7 Dungeness crab and the rest were rock crab. When you're crabbing, there are restrictions on which crab you can actually take and then keep. The rest of them you have to throw back because they're either too young or you're not allowed to take females. So there's that, but rock crab of any size you can take. They're, I guess, super highly populous and pretty hard to get rid of. And any other invasive crab that you find, you're more than welcome to. But basically the format is you rent a boat if you don't own one yourself and go out for usually 3 hours. Try to catch as many as you can with 3 rings that you lay down. Lay down the rings and then give them about 10 to 15 minutes. And there's chicken bait that's tied to the crab rings, so the crab try to get to the chicken. But occasionally, in which this did happen to us on our last lap around, the sea lions will swim down and they will just unclip the whole thing of bait and then take all your chicken. And that happened to one of our rings. We were robbed. Yep.
Accursed seals.
Yep.
What did you get to eat? The rock crab then?
Yeah, the rock crab and the Dungeness, we cooked all of them and then had them the same day for dinner.
Nice. Lots of butter?
Mm-hmm. We make a lemon butter, and some people let it soak in the lemon butter, other people just dip it. Other people steal from other people's plate while it's soaking in the lemon butter. It's very competitive.
Well, it sounds delicious and fun.
Yeah. I also got to read some. I haven't really been hooked on a book in a really long time, but there's a series called the Dark Elf Trilogy that I've been really into. It's set in the D&D universe, so all the same rules and factions and races apply that you know from BG3. And it's set in Menzo Berenzin, the capital city of the Drow, the Lolthsworn Drow, in the Underdark. And your main character is a boy of one of the noble houses, like one of the lower tier noble houses. So it's really cool getting to see the culture and politics of the evil Lolthsworn Drow and all their fucked up dark magic rituals and so on. And what would happen if you had a good aligned character who was born into that society? Would the good aligned character be able to exist and not break the laws and advance the situation without doing like the murderous Lolth stuff of the Spider Queen? And the answer is basically no. You're going to have too much friction with society if you're standing on principles of like, well, why should we kill this person? We don't have any evidence that they're a threat to us. And they're like, what the fuck? You're not allowed to say that. You go to jail now. Or we whip you now because you're not doing as you're told. It's a very command-oriented society, very merit-based, but also very backstabby, where it doesn't really value loyalty. It celebrates betrayal if you're able to get away with the betrayal. So I think Lolth society would be classified as lawful evil, or maybe chaotic evil. It's one of the two of those. Because they do have a system of law, and they will punish someone if they're caught trying to kill another house's people, and you don't kill all of them, then you basically get yourself killed by having hell portals opened into your house. But if you kill everyone in a noble house, then you advance up in rank, and everyone who was affected by that would advance up in rank, and you're kind of applauded for doing that dirty deed. So it's a very, very evil society, and Drizzt Do'Urden is a good character. He has a good nature about him, and he's trained by someone who's good. So it's kind of a battle for him and his principles. But very cool. I've finished the first 2 books in the trilogy.
Would you recommend it thus far?
Yeah, definitely. It's pretty combat oriented for as far as books go. There are a lot of like fantasy books, and those settings can be very centered on romance or very centered on politics or be more of a historical piece, but this one's more, you can kind of almost see the D&D fight in front of you. Like, it's a hook horror room. Oh shit, well, these do everything that a hook horror does, and as the reader, if you know what hook horrors are, you kind of know more or less how the combat could go. So it's fun in that sense, where it's like, I kind of know the threat level these pose and the kind of stuff that they do. So you get to see the character fight it. His class, it's kind of stated a couple times, but he's a fighter. If you're a drow male, you can't be in the priesthood of Lolth, because it's like a matriarchal society. Women run the show. But if you're a male, you can either be a fighter or a wizard. Those are your 2 choices to advance your situation and get some kind of specialization. And he ends up initially being thrown in the direction of wizard, but his father, who you find out later is his father, he highly recommends that he become a fighter just because of how fast his reflexes are. So he's a really agile character who's probably a mixture of fighter and ranger. And you get to see him take fights and kind of imagine what those moves might be with the D&D universe. That's fun. I haven't read any books that are set in the D&D universe until now.
I don't think I've ever read any.
Apparently there are like 18 or something that are using this guy as a main character, or he's involved in them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so this trilogy is just part of it. I also kind of get the spoiler then that he probably doesn't die if there are 18 books. But who knows? Be careful when you Google stuff. I found this out in an anime when I was just trying to Google a character to learn about what their abilities were and the extent of them and stuff, and the first autocomplete was character name dead. And I'm like, fuck. I just wanted to learn his abilities, not find out that he dies at some point in the story.
Yeah, Google does have a lot of spoilers, unfortunately.
Oops.
Well, good. You've had a fun couple weeks.
Yeah. How was your time? What did you do?
I'm inert by nature, so not much.
He's big chillin', I respect it.
I did that walk challenge you gave me, so there's that.
Good.
And then I also finished the 2 KOTOR games.
Ooh.
So I knocked those out.
What were your thoughts on those? Because I enjoyed both of them a lot, and I guess also another follow-up question, what alignment did you complete for the stories?
I pretty much always default to light side or good or whatever, so no change there. Yeah, overall, I liked them. I think I liked the second game better than the first, actually. Personal preference. Both good, just preferred the second one.
What'd you like more
And
about the second one?
I just liked it more thematically speaking. I thought its themes were more interesting, and I thought it took a more interesting direction with its story. But both games had a not insignificant amount of jank.
Yeah.
I noticed that. Yeah, that could be a little grating at times. So pretty good experience overall. If the story had not been as good as it was, I probably would not have finished either of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was pretty ready to move on by the time I was finished, just because I was tired of dealing with the bullshit.
Yeah, the mechanics of it. It's sort of
Yeah,
a similar format to Baldur's Gate 3, but nowhere near as polished and responsive.
yeah, I think it was more of a problem in the first game. In the second game, they had a lot more quality of life improvements that kind of dealt with a lot of the problems in the first game, but the second game had the problem of being basically unfinished. And so its jank was more there. And some of that could be very aggravating, but there wasn't as much of it, so it wasn't as much of a problem. So yeah, good stuff, good recommendation. Thank you.
Nice. Yeah, I like the time period. I think that's probably my favorite part of the KOTOR games is it's a completely fresh time period, so any character that you know from the movies is not there. This is way far before then. And it's a very different state of the universe compared to the powerful empire and the weakened republic of the movies. In the prequel movies with Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn and so on, and Darth Maul, the Republic is in its sunset, where it's becoming corrupt and abusable and like in a weakened state to where Palpatine can turn the tables on the Jedi and have the advantage. So they're not at their apex. In the KOTOR games, the Republic is strong, but the Sith are also still a living species that has a homeworld and stuff, and they have a strong presence too.
Yeah.
So it's more of a contested universe than in the movies, where it's typically pretty one-sided.
Yeah, definitely a different look at the universe, a different manifestation of Star Wars.
Did you have any favorite abilities?
Not critical strike.
And why
I
not
learned the
Critical
hard
Strike?
way how bad that is.
Oh, why is it bad? I don't remember. I haven't played it in a long time.
It doesn't really add that much damage, and it's unlikely to even trigger in the first place. You're way better off, mathematically speaking, with just about anything else.
I see.
So I didn't know that when I started the first game, and because I was doing like a scoundrel, I guess, I leaned into critical strike. I figured I would just focus on it, and even though I kind of struggled early, I figured, well, eventually it must become useful, right? And I didn't figure out until like halfway into the game that no, it really doesn't. So kind of had a hard time in the first game, especially in the final boss battle. I had to resort to just using mines and running around in circles. It was very goofy.
That's funny.
Yeah, so the second game, I learned the lesson from the first, and I had a much, much better build, and everything was way, way easier.
I see.
Yeah, I went through the second game like a hot knife through butter, polar opposite of my experience in the first.
That was
So
probably due to the experience in the first game. So you might have enjoyed the first game more if you just had a stronger build.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. But again, it wasn't really the gameplay that made me favor the second, mostly the story. Just liked it better in general. But yeah, if I went back and played the first game again, it would probably be a smoother, more enjoyable experience overall.
What color lightsaber did you go with?
I just went with green. I was very boring.
It's fair. Did you go Jedi Consular?
I did.
Nice.
Is that a popular choice?
Well, that's the what would choose green. Consulars usually have green lightsaber. Guardians have blue,
right.
and Sentinels have yellow. So you played within the rules. I don't know if you intended that.
I mean, you can. Wait, what was that?
It's not a hard and fast rule, but typically Jedi Consulars will have a green one, Guardians will have a blue one, and Sentinels have a yellow one.
Yeah. I mean, you can change the color, though, right? You just have to change the crystal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyone can equip any crystal. That's just the convention that they tell you.
Yeah. No, I picked Counselor just because I was. As I've gotten older in RPGs like these, I notice these days I tend to go for speech-focused builds. Just because I think that generally opens up more dialogue options in the story, so you have more to kind of play with there. You can learn more about what's going on. So I kind of did that, and the Jedi Counselor fits that. You know, it kind of gives you more persuasion bumps and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it seemed to suit my play style, basically.
Awesome. Well, what's been happening in the world? I guess I did some real world exploration by driving from South Dakota to Oregon, so I got to go through Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Washington State on the way there.
It must be one hell of a drive.
Yeah, it's pretty far. It was like a 3-day ordeal.
Lots of mountain roads.
Mm-hmm. Mostly highway, though. The interstate system is pretty good for just about everything.
Well, was there a lot of diversity in the scenery, or is it mostly just rocks and mountains?
It is pretty varied as you go. There are stretches that are very dry. It's just like desert and sagebrush. And then there are some parts that are a lot more wooded, like they're pretty dense forest. It depends on the amount of rainfall that the area gets. But yeah, Montana's pretty wooded and pretty. Wyoming is just wind and flat nothingness, but it's pretty high altitude. It's a pretty interesting drive. You also drive through some Crow land, the Native American reservation.
Yeah, very few people.
Mm-hmm.
Sparsely populated, as I recall. Did you drive through the Snake Valley at all?
I don't think so. What's that about?
Well, it's the most populated part of Idaho. That's where all the people live. That's where most of the farms are, etc. The Snake River is the largest river in Idaho. And so that whole basin, basically the valley that it forms, is like the economic and demographic center of the state. So I was curious if you had gone through it at all.
Ah, I see. No, I don't recall. I did sleep for a lot of the drive.
Oh, yeah.
Tactically stay up late, so you're really tired, so then when you're in the car, you just sleep.
There you go. Just pass the trip unconscious.
Yep. It's like time travel.
Wyoming? What part of Montana did you drive through?
We went through Billings. I know for sure that was a pretty large city. It had a lot of just kind of corporate suburban commercialism stuff. So pretty standard America in that sense.
Interesting. Just kind of out in the mountains, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Did it seem nice? Did you like it?
Yeah. It's a pretty cool part of the country. It's like super duper, I would guess, difficult to live there in the winter, assuming you don't have like modern shelter, which I guess is why a lot of these states have a pretty low population. Because they're aesthetically pretty nice, so I'm guessing the lack of population is probably due to that they have fewer resources. Like once the gold is gone, a lot of people left. A lot of the states have their kind of gold rush states where they found resources, and then once the resources dried up, there isn't really a reason to stay there, because it's not like a Los Angeles, California, where it's vacation temperatures the whole year long. The winters are pretty brutal, and it also limits the growing season too, so it's not as productive for farming if it's gonna either kill your crops or limit the amount of time that they can grow.
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary. Yeah, there's just not a lot of impetus for population growth to have out there. Yeah, like you say, it was originally more about grazing cattle and mining. And both of those industries kind of have a cap to how far they can take you before you need other economic drivers to emerge, and didn't really happen out there. And it's just remote. You know, port cities have the benefit of being kind of well connected to the international trade. And so you can become a logistical node and generate some growth from that. Much harder to do that if you're just like in the middle of the continent.
Yeah.
And they never really developed like big services sector drivers. Like one of the big economic drivers in big metros over the past couple decades, actually more than that, like half a century, has been universities, hospitals, research centers, stuff like that. And generally, the bigger cities have the money to kind of invest in those, or at least attract the investment from either the private sector or from the government. It tends to be harder to do that if you're just kind of out in the boonies, out in the western US. That's why Pittsburgh basically still exists. Steel industry kind of died, but while the city was still rich and growing, they invested in universities, hospitals, etc. And so they made themselves a nice little services-based fallback series of economic drivers. It wasn't really enough to fully offset the loss of the steel industry, but it did kind of help float the city until other industries could kind of emerge, generally finance and tech related. But places like Billings or Helena, you know, out west, they never really got big enough in the first place to really invest in institutions like that. And so they just never really got them. I think Helena has attracted some tech workers, basically those, what do you call them, tech nomads, people like that. But I don't know that it's enough to really form like a good, reliable core that could kind of propel the city forward. Yeah, it's even more stark in places like Wyoming. I don't think they really have anything going on there besides raw resource extraction. Coal specifically is actually the big one in Wyoming. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but Wyoming is the leading coal producer in the United States, more so than even West Virginia.
Did not know that.
Idaho just does potatoes.
Yep.
Yeah. Even less diverse than Montana.
We drove through Richland, Washington as well, and there's a lot of nuclear development stuff that's out in that area. I think it's like Hanford Nuclear Research Site. So a lot of business and stuff is out there just kind of hovering around the people who are working on those projects.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Eastern Washington over there is very desertous. They get very little rain because a lot of it gets blocked by the mountain range. So you can grow stuff, you just have to artificially irrigate. It makes it really good wine country for that reason, because the soil is good quality, but the rainfall wouldn't create a natural like forest or something there.
Yeah. Semi-arid. Don't they grow a lot of apples in eastern Washington, or is that a different place?
Yes, Washington has a lot of apples. They, I think, eclipse New York. New York used to be the Big Apple, like the state that produced the most apples, and then Washington State said, "Hold my bushel." A very, say, lush and productive state. Washington is. Downside would be it's cold because it's pretty far north.
I think the other big distinguishing feature for that region is that a whole bunch of the land is still owned by the federal government. Like lots of national parks, that kind of thing, federal land.
Yeah. Yeah, it
You didn't
chops
drive
up
through it, but Nevada is particularly stark in that regard. Something like 80% of Nevada is still federal land.
Wow. Yeah, the communities in Washington State are maybe a bit nicer for that reason in a lot of cases, because they'll partition off a lot of forest area between the houses, so it's not just complete suburban sprawl and concrete. You've got like natural habitats and stuff that are still existing there alongside people and their stinkiness. I saw a little social media post that was quizzing people on what they think the most polluted country in the world is. And it seemed like most people tend to guess China or India because they're very large countries. Maybe some of those create the most pollution in absolute terms, but the metrics were air quality index, like which countries has the very worst air. What do you think it is? Or do you already know?
I don't already know. I would have to think about it.
Okay.
And you said that the metric was air?
Yeah, air quality index.
Air quality index. I guess I would go India, but that's just a guess. So which is it?
It's a country bordering India.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Bordering India. Well, it must be one with industry, so it's not going to be like Nepal or something. Or
Correct.
Sri
It's not
Lanka.
Nepal. Correct.
I mean, the only other one that would really qualify, well, the two that would qualify would be Pakistan and Bangladesh.
And
I guess Bangladesh?
well, they're both the top two most polluted.
Oh, they're the top two? Okay.
Yeah. Pakistan is the most.
Pakistan is the most. Okay, I was going to say Bangladesh has more light industry, which can generate a lot of pollution, but I don't know how much pollution it generates in terms of air pollution. But I guess it's a lot since it's still up there. Pakistan makes more sense to me. That doesn't surprise me. But I would still think India would be worse.
Yeah. If you were just measuring the maybe carbon tonnage that you're putting into the atmosphere, I would think that China or India would be ahead.
Well, there's particular times of year when it gets really bad in India. So if only for that reason, I would have thought they'd have been number one. They have this practice of burning cropland, farmland, seasonally. And because farmers do it basically all at once, it creates huge amounts of smoke. and it basically smokes out the big cities. It makes the air almost unbreathable. And then there's things like holidays where they use a whole shit ton of fireworks that also gets so bad that it makes the air almost unbreathable. So, just things like that. It all kind of adds up.
Chat's saying that Korean air is bad. Why would Korean air be bad?
They get a lot of, what do they call it? Fine dust particles, something like that. Basically, dust storms that start in China will actually flow into Korea, and they pick up pollutants basically on the way.
Ew.
Because the air in China can be very polluted too, so it intermixes with the sand, and then it gets out into Korea, and it gets to be an issue.
Ugh. Let's see.
Yeah, northern China still can get some pretty gnarly sandstorms now and again. It's gotten better over time. They've had a big forestation effort to try to mitigate it. But even with the success of that program, they still get a fair amount.
We haven't had a discussion in a little bit. Has there been any big ticket changes in the world?
Not really. There's been stuff happening, especially vis-a-vis Iran. But with Iran, it was mostly just Trump being Trump and saying there's an agreement when there's not. Supposedly, there was an agreement announced today. But I noticed in the details that it's not really like a full agreement that fully resolves all issues. It's more just a temporary ceasefire that will involve opening the Strait of Hormuz. Mm-hmm. But the other underlying issues that Washington has been pretending to care about, those don't seem to be part of it. Those are basically to be determined. They're going to negotiate those over the next couple months. So we'll see if that actually holds. I'm a little dubious. But that is probably the big ticket item as of right now. But other than that, I didn't have any like big stuff that stood out to me. There were some riots in Northern Ireland. Had to do with a migrant getting into some kind of altercation with a local and then trying to decapitate him.
What the fuck?
Yeah. So the anti-immigrant crowd really leaned into that, and there was some riots that resulted.
I can imagine.
Oh yeah, and then the Carolina Hurricanes won this year's Stanley Cup. So congrats to them. They beat the Knights. I've basically stopped watching hockey. I don't have any particular reason. Just sports in general hasn't really attracted me much. I'll follow some of the statistics. I'll follow the geography, but beyond that, I just haven't really watched anything in a long time. But I've heard that it was a very good series.
Yeah, I watched some of it.
Oh yeah? What did you think?
Good games. The athleticism and flexibility of goalies is always funny to see when you haven't watched hockey for a little bit. They have like super fast reflexes and they're flexible like a Pilates mom at the same time. Like do crazy splits and stuff and have very fast twitch reflexes, and they're also big. Because the taller you are, the more area you just naturally block.
Yeah. It's almost exact. Well, no, it is exactly 20 years since they won their last cup, 2006.
That's been a while.
Yeah, it has. They've been in contention before too. Mm-hmm. They always seem to make it to the conference finals and then lose. That seemed to be their pattern, or just not make the playoffs at all, one or the other. So it's nice to see them finally break through. Also, it continues the dominance of the Southeast Division. Well, I guess that doesn't exist anymore. I still think in the old divisions. Yeah, the Southeastern teams have been doing well the past 10 years. The Florida Panthers, the Tampa Bay Lightning, and now the Carolina Hurricanes have all won cups now over the past, what, 8 years, I guess, something like that. So they've been weirdly dominant.
Yeah, and this is a region of the U.S. that historically doesn't get snowfall.
Correct.
Yeah.
Which not a few Canadians are butthurt about. Why do they get teams and we don't? They should be grateful. What is it? Something like a quarter of Canada's pro hockey teams just were failed experiments in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the NHL has been talking about expansion again, and they've been seriously considering Atlanta again, much to my surprise. You'd think after it failed twice they would give up, but I guess not. So that's good news for Canada. That'll be their next team.
It's creating jobs. More hockey teams, more hockey players.
Yeah. Well, let's see. So what is this? This is 3 weeks, I guess, that we didn't cover.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this will be 3 weeks worth of Iran updates.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll try to get through it quickly. It shouldn't be too big a deal. Because mostly it's just posturing. This is one or the other government trying to bullshit the other. Let's see, we can skip that actually. So basically, the crux of this is just going to be a series of escalatory spirals. And the background is that the US and Iranian governments, over the past 3 weeks, have been negotiating some kind of agreement that presumably is the one that culminated in the agreement that was announced today. So that was going on, and there was a lot of posturing. But in the meantime, there were a couple of escalatory spirals that resulted from violence, and eventually didn't go anywhere, but is worth talking about since that's basically the main item here as far as Iran updates. So a couple weeks ago, the U.S. launched airstrikes targeting the Iranian coast, specifically the coast adjacent to the Strait of Hormuz. Washington said that it hit missile sites and boats and justified it in terms of quote-unquote self-defense. Make of that what you will. So the U.S. government later said that the rationale, the impetus here, was that the boats targeted were laying mines, or were in the process of attempting to lay mines in the Strait of Hormuz. So the Iranians largely held back there, so nothing really came of it. So basically the timeline was the Iranians try to lay mines, the U.S. retaliates, and then the violence stops. This was probably the most peaceful of these spirals. So the next one came when the United States disabled what was described as an empty oil tanker that Washington argued was attempting to breach the blockade. Not sure how an empty oil tanker does that, but that's what I have in my notes here. So the Iranians retaliated to that by launching some drones at some other merchant ships adjacent to the strait. Some of those were shot down by the U.S., and the United States retaliated by hitting some targets on Qasem Island, which is one of Iran's islands in the Strait of Hormuz. And that's when the spiral stopped.
See.
So the third spiral started with Iran trying to enforce their blockade by attacking some merchant ships with drones. And that led to US and Israeli retaliation. They also hit an unladen tanker heading toward the strait, but it wasn't clear to me if that was just them enforcing their own blockade or if that was part of their retaliation. It's a little unclear. So after the US and Israeli airstrikes, Iran retaliated in turn by hitting targets in Kuwait and Bahrain, including Kuwait's international airport. And that in turn led to further US retaliation with airstrikes targeting, once again, Keshem Island. And at that point, the spiral ended. Mind you, every time these spirals start, there's a question of what impact they would have on ongoing negotiations. And invariably, there would come a point when either Washington, either Washington or Tehran, if not both, would basically just stop retaliating so that they could preserve the ongoing negotiations and focus on them. So the fourth and final escalatory spiral was this past week. The Iranians apparently downed an Apache attack helicopter over the over the Persian Gulf. Wasn't entirely clear how they did that, but it came out later. Supposedly, anyway, it was a drone that the Iranians flew into the helicopter. And it's not clear what kind of drone, if it was like a smaller one, like a, what do they call them, first-person view, or if it was one of the bigger Shahed-type drones. Mm-hmm. But regardless, somehow they managed to hit the Apache and down it. So that led to U.S. retaliation with airstrikes on targets within Iran. And then Iran retaliated to that, attacking American bases in the region. Again, Bahrain was targeted, and then in this case, Jordan was targeted. By the way, both of the crewmen on the Apache survived, and I have an interesting side note here. Apparently, they were recovered from the Persian Gulf with a unmanned sea drone, which I thought was pretty interesting. Yeah, something called a Corsair unmanned sea drone was dispatched to pick them up. So I thought that was neat. I had never heard that before. That might be the first drone recovery, the first seaborne recovery of downed personnel by a drone.
Cool.
Yeah. So that was the drama over the past couple weeks. It wasn't clear if any of these escalatory spirals might continue to spiral out and jeopardize talks, but ultimately none of them did.
Reached a steady state then.
Pretty much, yeah. So the other big item on Iran is just the ongoing negotiations themselves. And I had a bunch of stuff. There was kind of a false start. There was a deal announced, I think, last weekend. But then Trump at the last minute scuppered it because he didn't like the terms. So then there was an additional week of negotiations that resulted in the agreement we nominally have now. So a lot of this is basically extraneous at this point. I'll kind of give you the Cliff Notes version. So basically the big item that Iranian and American negotiations were stuck on was, from what I've read, assets, specifically Iranian assets that were frozen by American sanctions. Other items they had apparently, supposedly, reached a nominal agreement on, but they could not agree on how to handle Iranian assets. So the talks were basically stuck on that. It wasn't really clear exactly what the consensus items were. You know, the Trump administration and to a lesser degree the Iranian government had both said at different times that they had broadly reached agreement on other items of dispute. But neither of them really gave any hints as to just what specific areas they had agreed on and just what the terms of agreement were. So based off of evidence that's come out in the past week, and then also aspects of the deal that were announced today, it seems like they haven't really agreed on all that much. Ceasefire is the big thing. They're going to halt all offensive operations against each other going forward. And also, regarding the ceasefire, another big item is that the ceasefire is going to encompass Lebanon. So basically, hostilities should hypothetically cease going forward. So the other big item is the Strait of Hormuz. Both Iran and the United States say that they're going to end their respective blockades. However, I did note when I was reading more about this that the US is supposed to lift its blockade within the next 30 days. So this is not necessarily going to be immediate. It's not clear if the Iranians have a similar time frame that they're going to work within. We'll have to wait for more details on that. But it looks like either immediately or sometime in the next month, the blockades should end and the strait should nominally open. That's my understanding given what I know now. So the strait should open. That should ease the pressure on energy markets, among others. We've talked about all the other industries that have kind of been affected by this. So between that and the end of the ceasefire, the conflict, such as it's been for the past month and change, seems to have concluded. There are other issues that were kind of driving the conflict. So ballistic missiles, Iran's nuclear program, and Iranian support for proxies are generally cited as the main adjutants in Iranian-American relations. It's not clear that there's been any real progress there. Again, what I read is that the nuclear issue in particular is supposed to be negotiated over the course of the next 60 days. Supposedly, there is a nominal framework in place that will sort of be the basis for progress, but I haven't heard anything concrete. Supposedly, the Iranians have agreed nominally to gather up the fissile material that they have either in storage or that's buried, and they're going to transfer it out of the country. But it's not clear how that's going to be overseen, what the time frame is going to be, etc. So all the details of that are very ambiguous. So we'll see. But the agreement in place now is not any kind of final agreement. It's just a memorandum of understanding, quote unquote. And the nuclear side of American-Iranian issues is not resolved. They've basically kicked the can down the road for 2 months. And so we'll see where we are in, what is it, mid-June? So it'll be mid-August, thereabouts, before the next deadline hits. And in virtually every other agreement that's been reached thus far in the conflict, they've either reached an agreement just before a deadline or immediately after. So probably we will not hear anything about any kind of nuclear agreement until sometime in August, would be my guess. Which will probably suit all parties involved fine. They're probably ready to take a break from the fighting, or maybe even just end it completely, and 2 months is plenty of time to basically let things cool off, recover, and then maybe come up with some bullshit excuses to kick the can down the road even further, and further delay negotiations. Which is my forecast for what will happen. That's my best guess right now. We'll see in 2 months, but I suspect that's the direction it's going to go. Proxies and ballistic missiles were not mentioned at all, near as I can tell. You could argue that ballistic missiles are kind of inherently part of the nuclear negotiation. I could see that. But the proxies are definitely not, and it just doesn't seem to have been brought up. So I don't know if there's clauses in there that just haven't been mentioned publicly, or if they're just treating that as something separate. From what I've read, assets and sanctions relief are going to tie into the nuclear negotiations. So basically, they've got some kind of timetable they're trying to negotiate by which the Iranians will be expected to do certain things, reach certain thresholds by certain deadlines, and that depending on their performance, there will be corresponding degrees of asset releases and sanctions relief. Not really that different from previous such negotiated agreements, so no surprises. It's the details are going to be where the issue is. And of course, there's the usual bluster. Trump is saying that if an agreement isn't reached, then we'll kill people. Well, we'll resume attacking Iran, etc. So no surprises there. That's pretty much where we're at. The Strait hypothetically will reopen. Global markets should recover if and when that happens. That'll take the pressure off pretty much everybody to kind of further progress the talks, since that was the main agitant. If fighting resumes, then I don't doubt that it'll close again in short order. So I think that'll be a pretty strong deterrent to future resumption of hostilities. The main issue, from my perspective, just again, given what I've read, is going to be Lebanon. Because the Iranians have insisted that Lebanon be covered by the ceasefire. The Israelis do not want to do that. The next section I have here is specifically about Lebanon, so I'll kind of get into that in more detail. But as far as its relation to the ceasefire that has been now negotiated, I strongly suspect that the Israelis are not going to respect it. And that's going to tempt the Iranians then to launch attacks against Israel. And that'll be interesting because it could be that the US government just doesn't do anything. They may stand back and say that, hey, we're going to respect the ceasefire. If the Israelis don't, then the consequences are on them. On the other hand, they could retaliate in response to Iranian attacks on Israel. And at that point, the ceasefire is basically off. And then you could see a rapid closure again of the Strait, in which case they're basically back to square one. And I would point out that this is not unpredictable, like given Israeli behavior thus far. Like you kind of expect them to just kind of ignore any ceasefire in place vis-a-vis Lebanon. So it could be that the Iranians were counting on this and that they're basically leaning on this to shift pressure internationally onto the United States and Israel. In other words, they're not actually interested in opening the Strait or progressing negotiations. This may just be a tactical move on their part to shift global pressure more onto the United States and Israel. So those are basically three different possibilities there for how Lebanon could play out in terms of its impact on the ceasefire agreement that was announced today. We'll see. It's pretty wide open right now. The conflict has been nothing if not unpredictable thus far. I don't see any reason to expect it to continue to be so. So Lebanon. There's been more and more drama there. And actually, the section after this is Iranian politics. And I think both the section on Iranian politics and Lebanon illustrate the political tensions and divisions within the respective sides in the conflict, which is basically acting as incentive to end the conflict. Because there are issues in both camps at this point. And without unity, it's kind of hard to keep going, in any conflict. So for the US and Israel, Lebanon is one of the big issues. And this has kind of spilled out into the open over the past week or two. Going back, I think, 2 weeks, there was ongoing Israeli attacks on Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Hezbollah had retaliated, and Netanyahu and the Israeli government were on the verge, apparently, of launching some major new attacks on Hezbollah in Beirut in retaliation. And the US government, specifically President Trump, apparently talked him down. And supposedly there was yelling. Supposedly Trump yelled at him. The phone call was described as tense, quote unquote. So that was the first angry phone call between Trump and Netanyahu. It did serve its purpose. It did serve to de-escalate things between Hezbollah and Israel. And the result was a ceasefire agreement that both Hezbollah and Israel were sort of pressured into by the Trump administration. And so the deal initially announced is that Israel would refrain from bombing Beirut in exchange for Hezbollah agreeing not to attack Israel. So that was the agreement that was announced at first. There was either another agreement or an addendum to the first agreement that was announced later, supposedly mediated by the US State Department, in which Israel and Lebanon basically agreed that they would stop fighting if Hezbollah pulled out of areas near the border. Sorry, Israel would basically agree to stop attacking Hezbollah if Hezbollah agreed to withdraw from the border area. So nominally that was agreed to by Hezbollah as well. But Hezbollah, one, did not pull out of the border area, and two, continued to fire on Israeli targets in Lebanon. They did not continue to fire on targets in Israel, from what I read, but the Israeli government argued that this still represented a violation of the ceasefire. And so basically, fighting continued unabated, and the ceasefire effectively never went into force. It was announced, but fighting effectively went on unimpeded, so it was basically meaningless. So that led to an escalatory spiral. As fighting went on, eventually Israel just bombed Beirut. And that led to Iranian retaliation. The Iranians launched a volley of ballistic missiles at Israeli targets. And that led to Israeli retaliation, with them hitting targets, I think, in southern Iran that were related to Iran's energy industry. And there was a bit of tit for tat that kind of went on for a day or two after that. Eventually, there was a total of 30 missiles fired by Iran at Israel, and multiple Israeli airstrikes on Iran. And eventually, this culminated in another angry phone call between Trump and Netanyahu, in which he basically yelled him down and all but forced him to cease the escalatory spiral, the tit for tat attacks.
Why would he have a strong opinion about this?
Because it was jeopardizing the talks with Iran. The Iranian government had argued from the start, from the first ceasefire that was announced more than a month ago, that Lebanon was supposed to be covered, and that the more the Israelis attacked Hezbollah, then the more danger there was that the Iranians would just walk away from the agreement, walk away from the talks.
I see.
And so as Israeli operations in Lebanon against Hezbollah escalated, the Iranians were making more and more noise about it, and the Trump administration in turn put more and more pressure on the Israelis to de-escalate, which the Israelis have largely resisted. So nominally, the Israelis have agreed to refrain from hitting Beirut, but combat operations in southern Lebanon have continued and in fact have escalated to the point where they told the entire population of the city of Tyre in southern Lebanon to evacuate. It's not clear if they're looking to move in and occupy it, or if they're just telling them to evacuate because they want to conduct airstrikes and other operations targeting Hezbollah there. Regardless, it's an escalation, and it's not really doing the Israelis any favors in Lebanon. There is a public sentiment in Lebanon against Hezbollah. The broader public does kind of blame them for the escalation of hostilities. But at the same time, nobody really wants to be seen as pro-Israel in Lebanon either. And the further into Lebanon Israel pushes, the more public sentiment has shifted away from blaming Hezbollah towards blaming Israel. So I don't know that the Israelis necessarily care about that, but they are getting more ambitious in terms of their incursion into Lebanon the more the conflict goes on. And the more the fighting goes on, the more the Iranians cite it as an example of Israeli-American duplicity, and that we're not really serious about negotiating with them. So therein lies the danger, and that's why I highlighted Lebanon as probably the main reason the ceasefire announced today will ultimately fail. Because the Israeli government has shown again and again that it's really not interested in curtailing these operations. It is dead set on fighting Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. So how the Iranians respond to that, and in turn how the United States responds to potential Iranian escalation, I think those are going to be the two major determinants here for how things go moving forward. So let's see. So that's Israel and the United States. On the Iranian side, there are some cleavages within their government that are emerging. They're still pretty minor, and I've still got to think that the IRGC has a lock on things. But it's worth talking about what cleavages have emerged. For one, the president of Iran, President Pezeshkian, actually offered his resignation to the supreme leader. And he specifically cited loss of power since the IRGC had taken on more responsibilities with the beginning of the war. Essentially, the IRGC has seized emergency powers and has taken responsibility not only for the war effort, but broad swaths of the government, to the point where the president is basically just a figurehead at this point. So he offered some largely superficial pushback on that by offering his resignation and gently pushing back on the IRGC. I don't think his resignation has been accepted, so I think he is still president, but that does illustrate that the civilian institutions within Iran, such as they are, have become basically, I don't want to say completely marginalized. I imagine they still have some authority, but it's at the point now where they don't really matter. You can pretty safely ignore them. If you want to negotiate with the Iranian government at this point, you need to negotiate either with the supreme leader or with the IRGC. The civilian institutions outside of those two institutions are pretty moribund at this point. So let's see, there's also an ongoing debate that is actually relatively open in Iran about just how they should proceed with the conflict. Some of the debate centers around how best to retaliate to US and Israeli strikes. There's some people who have argued that they should be specifically targeting American personnel more in order to generate maximum casualties. Not necessarily enough to just stop the US in its tracks. That's not really feasible. But the argumentation here is just that the more casualties are generated, the more pressure will be on the US government. Since American governments and the broader American polity is much more sensitive, basically, to American casualties than they are just to ongoing conflict. You know, even if the occasional American drone is shot down or an Apache helicopter, for example, is downed, so long as casualties are near zero, the broader public doesn't necessarily care too much. And so these people are basically arguing that there needs to be more. They need to make that a core part of their retaliation, to try to generate maximum body bags in order to generate, in turn, maximum political pressure within domestic American politics to the American government. There's also a different debate here about, again, this has to do with retaliating to US strikes. Others argue that they need to focus on supporting Hezbollah. So it would be better, instead of focusing on, you know, killing American servicemen or what have you, or just launching generic, you know, ballistic missile volleys at American targets in places like Kuwait or Bahrain, it would be better to focus on Lebanon and Israel so that they can help Hezbollah as much as possible. Now, there's a separate debate entirely over the balance between diplomacy and force. This is basically your traditional hawks and doves stuff. Some people say that they really need to lean into military force and that diplomacy is entirely secondary. But the more dovish faction argues that diplomacy should be the centerpiece, that they need to focus on that and try to mitigate force as much as possible so that they can mitigate, in turn, damage to the broader country, since, of course, the airstrikes and whatnot have done significant damage. Now, focusing on the doves specifically here, so some of their arguments against further escalation and for giving concessions center on three specific things here, is what I encountered in my reading. One, there's a danger of eroding Iran's diplomatic position internationally by closing the Strait of Hormuz for a prolonged period of time. The disruption of energy markets, among other markets, by closing the strait creates a lot of pressure around the world on governments that might otherwise be sympathetic to them. And so the argumentation here is that by closing the strait for a prolonged period of time, there's more of an incentive for those other countries to side with the United States and Israel in order to try to up the pressure on the Iranians to restore access to the strait. So in the short term, it could be feasible, but the dove argument is that in the long term, this creates problems diplomatically that could make it harder for them to resist pressure in the future. Let's see, they also argue that the United States has not really used its full gamut of cyber capabilities. The argument here is that the US could do significantly more damage to Iranian systems, technology, etc., if the conflict continues and eventually escalates, and that it would be better for the Iranian state to avoid this as much as possible. And let's see, the third item here is the threat to Iranian infrastructure. Infrastructure has been damaged in Iran pretty significantly by the war thus far, but there is the potential that the United States could significantly escalate, and as part of that escalation, target infrastructure even more than it already has. And that would do significant long-term damage, because a lot of the infrastructure the U.S. could target and destroy would take a long time to rebuild. You know, if the United States did target Iranian infrastructure on a broad basis, that would probably be like 5 to 10 years recovery, trying to rebuild all of it. And this is on top of Iran's already very difficult economic prospects, given the impact of sanctions and just general economic mismanagement within Iran. So from the Dove's perspective, all of that suggests that the Iranian country as a whole, the Iranian nation, would be much better off if the Iranian government took a more conciliatory approach to negotiations, gave more concessions, and brought the conflict to an earlier conclusion. In general, it's worth reminding the Doves are not in the driver's seat. The Hawks are very much paramount in Iranian politics at the moment. So a lot of these dovish arguments are not going to mean much in terms of the Iranian negotiating position. But these are arguments that have been made publicly. And there's probably not a few people within the establishment in Iran that are probably of like mind for a variety of reasons. Not all of them are necessarily altruistic. It's not necessarily the case that all of them are just really concerned about the well-being of the country. There's also self-interested actors that want the fighting to end so that they can basically get back to pilfering whatever public resources that they were pilfering before the conflict started. If you are stealing money from the public, you're going to be able to steal more if the country is at peace than if it's at war, unless you're just directly dialed into the military-industrial complex or something.
Yeah, war is expensive.
Yeah. And given all the damage to the civilian economy, that also curbs potential for corruption. So there's a lot of people for different reasons that are going to want peace in the short term. But my understanding is that they're kind of getting crowded out by the Hawks. And the IRGC in particular is disproportionately dominated by hawkish voices. So however much there may be debates and disputes within Iranian politics, I don't think realistically at this moment we can expect that to really sway the Iranian government. So a couple more items here. There was an interesting item in the Washington Post. Apparently the Qatari government, early in the conflict, tried to secretly negotiate with the Iranian state to try to avoid Iranian strikes on targets in Qatar. Specifically, they wanted them to avoid hitting their energy infrastructure. So from what I read, they were largely unsuccessful, but there was a kind of understanding, supposedly, that the Iranians should avoid at least hitting Qatar's major LNG infrastructure, which they largely did, actually. Supposedly, the quid pro quo was that the Iranians would agree to do that, and in exchange, the Qataris would voluntarily shut down their main LNG production facility. So that would in turn give the Iranians the benefit of shutting down Qatar's production, and the Qataris in turn would benefit from preserving that infrastructure such that they could just turn it back on relatively easily later. If it's destroyed outright, it takes years to replace it, so it's better for them if they can just shut it down voluntarily. So there was nothing officially agreed from what I read, but the Iranians did seem to avoid hitting it for a long time until some of their own energy infrastructure was hit, whereupon they actually did strike it directly. But I think the takeaway there is that states in the region were not really consulted on this whole conflict, and there's some resentment there. And some of the states that were more inclined to have more dovish relations with Iran in particular, seemed less inclined to cooperate with the United States and side with the United States and Israel in the conflict. So that could hypothetically augur more future such shenanigans. It may be the case that for the Qataris in particular, and maybe also the Saudis to a lesser degree, some faith in America's ability to provide for their security has been shaken. I don't think they doubt that the United States has the military capacity to protect them. The issue is that the United States is just very unpredictable in ways that are not good for the national interests of certain GCC nations. And so they're going to hedge their bets in future by continuing to pretend to go along with the United States and its security preferences in the region, while at the same time maintaining sort of secret, what's the word I want? Not back room, back channels, basically, to the Iranians that they can tap in order to negotiate and make it apparent that they don't always agree with everything the U.S. does, and that if the Iranians agree not to target them directly, that they may be willing to play ball and give them something in turn.
Who's benefiting from this conflict?
Israel. 100% Israel. Yeah, the GCC nations are kind of different minds about how useful the conflict is. I think the Emiratis are the most pro-war here. They're generally the most hawkish vis-a-vis Iran. The Saudis are kind of somewhere in the middle. They're not opposed to hitting Iran, but they would also prefer there to be some kind of actual strategy. They don't really want to just hit Iran for its own sake, which seems to be what the Trump administration is doing. So they're not thrilled about that. So in general, they're okay with hitting Iran, but they don't like the way that it's being done here. And then the Qataris, for their part, are the most dovish on Iran. And so they're likely the most upset about it. The Omanis have generally just been neutral regardless. So I'm sure for them, they would rather the conflict not have happened. But since it's happening, they prefer to play their traditional role of mediator. And all parties involved seem okay with that. So Oman hasn't been as impacted as the others on that count. But Israel has wanted to hit Iran for a long time and weaken them militarily. So I would say of the parties involved, they're the ones that are getting the most of what they wanted. Still not entirely clear what the US government wanted out of this. We've talked about that at length. There's a variety of different theories. We'll see what comes of it. I still suspect strongly that the Trump administration was just doing it to see what would happen. Apply pressure and see what concessions the other side makes, and if they don't make any, you can just shrug it off and move on to the next thing. That seems to be their modus operandi here with this and a number of other foreign policy adventures.
Yeah, kind of a throw your weight around stance.
Yeah. And as a final note here, for what it's worth, internet connectivity was restored in Iran on day 88. So apparently there is at least some ability to connect to the internet for those in Iran now. That's more than 2 months without. That's a long time to go without the internet, especially if you're chronically online.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could say the Israelis have benefited the most. The people who have lost the most are the chronically online in Iran. Rough couple months for them.
Damn. Gamer fan punish, and they didn't even ask for this.
That's it for the Iran update. Again, the latest drama is the agreement announced today. There's reason to believe it's not going to last very long, so we'll see. The next week will tell.
I was asking earlier if there was any change in the winds in the Ukraine conflict.
Yeah, there's been more talk about that in the past couple of weeks. I did kind of have it in my notes. Basically, the gist of it is that the Ukrainian army has gotten more combat effective, and the Russian army at the same time has gotten less combat effective. So that kind of ties into a couple different factors. I'll try to kind of run through my notes real quick on this. We've talked about some of this before. One, the Ukrainian army reorganized such that it shifted away from a model that was focused on brigades and focused more on corps. And so that served to basically allow better training, since it allowed for experienced personnel to interact more with raw recruits in a way that was not happening before in the brigade-centric model that they had been using. Ukrainian units have also gotten better at integrating basically combined arms warfare, integrating artillery, armor, infantry, etc. So coordination between different services and whatnot has improved over time. And then also the Ukrainians have gotten much better relatively recently too, like over the past year, at mid-ranged drone strikes. So before they had FPV drones, they still have them. Those do an immense amount of damage, for both sides. The Ukrainians over the past couple of years have been working on and perfecting long-range drone strikes. You've been hearing about those in the news a lot more in the past year in particular. Drone strikes on Russian oil infrastructure, Russian bomber bases in some cases. There was that one wild operation where they blew up a bunch of Tu-95s. But recently they've been getting much better at something in between, mid-range strikes that are designed to hit basically Russian logistical targets that are relatively close to the front line. And the idea there is that they're trying to disrupt the ability of the Russian army to keep their frontline units supplied. The Russians learned pretty early on in the war how vulnerable their logistics were. And so they responded to that by moving a lot of their depots, bases, whatnot, further away from the front line than had been the case at the start of the conflict. And so that kind of put them beyond the reach of a lot of the FPV drones that Ukraine had. But now, recently, the Ukrainians have perfected technology that allows them to start hitting those targets again. And that's been disrupting Russian operations. So things have improved in these regards on the Ukrainian side. On the Russian side, they're suffering from things like corruption, bribery. It's possible now for infantry to bribe their way out of offensives, which is popular because the offensives are pretty raw. They do depend on human wave attacks for the initial assaults. They'll generally follow those up with units that actually do know how to fight. They actually do have units that are pretty experienced, and those will be the follow-up units they throw in after, the human wave attack. But that initial attack tends to be tends to have experience high casualties, and a lot of guys do not want to participate. So that's a problem. The officers in general try to avoid accountability as much as possible, and as the conflict has progressed, opportunities for corruption have improved, and so networks have formed. And so the result is that guys protect each other, cover each other's asses. Bad news thus generally doesn't move up the chain of command much, and that mitigates accountability such that poor leadership is not properly punished. And that in turn limits the ability of Russian formations to improve over time, learn from mistakes, etc. That's not to say there hasn't been any improvement. It's just slowed down. The whole process is just mitigated and inhibited by corruption in the ranks and in the officer corps. There's also problems with Russian economy that have negatively impacted the supply chain of the Russian army. Russian production is still pretty good overall, but it's coming at a higher and higher opportunity cost to the civilian economy, and that's creating pressures that the Russian government is having increasing difficulties containing. It's still fine for now, but it is starting to show up in supply chains a bit. And then there's also corruption at the higher level of the officer corps, the flag officers responsible for actually managing supply chains have gotten more corrupt with time and more capricious. There's also, from what I've read, more of a culture of bureaucracy within the Russian military. This is something that's kind of always been there. This is kind of a Soviet thing. Actually, it's kind of a pre-Soviet thing. It's a Russian thing, let's say that. It's just overly bureaucratized. Decision making is very slow. People do not allow you to really be innovative. And part of that is just corruption. Ranking flag officers prefer everything to be centralized in terms of decision making, because that gives them more opportunities to steal shit. But even without that, it's still bureaucratic. That's just the overarching culture there. People have heard about corporate cultures, right? Cultures at companies and things. Individual bureaucracies also kind of have their own cultures in a similar vein. And in the Russian military, their culture is just sort of very, what's the word I want? Very centralized, very top heavy, and very counterintuitive to anybody who wants to take kind of a flat, decentralized approach to decision making. They just do not reward creativity in the same way that the Ukrainians have come to. So while they can innovate and actually do, it doesn't happen as fast as, say, with Ukraine, and that kind of hobbles some of their ability to adapt to changes on the battlefield.
Well, one of the things you told me about the Soviet approach historically was that you do exactly as Stalin tells you, even if situations on the battlefield change. You're not allowed to just kind of make an on-the-fly decision. You have to follow command.
Yeah, you're not really allowed to innovate or adapt. You've got to do what you're told, and if you don't, you could be punished for that. Mm-hmm. So a modern example of that I was reading about had to do with basically Russian civil society helping fund and supply drones to the Russian army. Like individual people on their own initiative were doing that, raising money to either give to drone formations and units in the Russian army, or to buy drones themselves and provide them. And the Russian bureaucracy has actually been very resistant to that. They don't actually like that, because they want procurement to be purely the domain of the Russian government. Partly that's just bureaucracy. They don't like people coloring outside the lines. But some of it, again, is corruption. Like, they would prefer all procurement to run through official channels, because that's just more money for the people that exploit those channels for their own financial benefit. So there's actually been pushback from the Russian state to these sort of small-scale NGOs that are trying to help the Russian army in this way. So this is an example of the Russian army and government, again, punishing people for actually taking the initiative here in a way that does help them, that does help the Russian war effort. So just over time, these problems kind of compound, and the Russian army is the worse off for it, and the Ukrainian army in turn has benefited. And it's at the point now, for I think the past couple months, the Ukrainians have been taking far fewer casualties than the Russians have. And this has even been the case when the Ukrainians have actually gone on the offensive. Normally, in warfare, if you go on the offensive, you invariably take more casualties than the guys defending. That's kind of a general rule. It doesn't always happen that way, but just in general, that's how things play out.
Defender's
and
advantage.
Over the past, defender's advantage. So for the past couple months, even when the Ukrainians have been attacking, they've been taking fewer casualties, not more, than the Russians. And that's generally been accredited to the general improvement in combat effectiveness for the various reasons I discussed. So that hasn't translated to big territorial gains. I don't think the Russians are in danger of being expelled from Ukraine anytime soon. But in general, it does suggest that some of the underlying calculus in the conflict is changing. Because before, so long as the Ukrainians are taking more casualties, the Russians had the advantage because they could just win by attrition. They could just wear the Ukrainians down over time by just keeping the war going for as long as it takes to basically pull through and wear out Ukraine's manpower reserve, which of course is smaller than that of Russia. But if the Ukrainians can inflict more casualties than they take, then it's possible that Russian manpower will run out before Ukrainian manpower does. Hypothetically, the Russians could just do a mass mobilization and they could just overwhelm the Ukrainians. But as we've discussed before, the Russians really seem averse to that. I don't know if because they're afraid of political consequences, if the general population of Russia is actually subjected to the full weight of having to support and fight in a conflict like this, or if it's more logistical in nature. It could be that they just don't think they have the resources to actually fully supply the huge ass army that would result from a genuine mass mobilization that pulls significant proportions of their fighting age men into the army. Regardless, for reasons known only to the Russian government, they have not done that. And they had thought they would be fine with that, they thought that would be okay so long as they had the advantage in terms of overall manpower, so long as they thought they could win a war of attrition with Ukraine. But the recent change suggests that maybe that's not going to be the case anymore. So if that trend does continue, where the Ukrainians are able to inflict more casualties than they suffer on a notable scale for a protracted period of time, that could then represent an incentive for the Russians to negotiate in earnest an actual ceasefire that brings the conflict to a conclusion. So that's been the discussion recently. Ukrainians doing better such that the underlying calculus changes, and maybe then, because of that, there is actually reason to think that the Russians might negotiate in good faith a ceasefire agreement. This is purely hypothetical. I haven't really seen much evidence of the Russian state moving in that direction. There has been more talk in Russian media about what a ceasefire could look like and how Russia actually has won the conflict already and that any concessions they give don't really matter. That suggests that maybe the government is thinking about a ceasefire, but until there are actual negotiations, I'm hesitant to actually give them any credit for it. I want to see some kind of tangible move here. Until then, I'm kind of dubious that any ceasefire is going to be in the cards, at least anytime soon.
Seems like a major blunder for how much territory they've gotten and how costly it's been. Because I think the initial expectation was Russia's a superpower, Ukraine is just a country, so Russia should just walk over and be able to just kind of take the city and put people in charge and it would be over. But the fact that they got so stuck, and they have taken some territory that they're sitting on that was formerly Ukrainian, but it hasn't been a convincing erosion of their area to the point that, yeah, they're trading better defensively, and then they're even starting to attack, which makes it more complex than how things were at the beginning when you had the surprise factor.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they're basically going for the war of attrition win condition where they're not going to be able to swing back and take Moscow or something, but if they just make it such a untenable trade, then they're slowly disincentivizing Russia from continuing.
Yeah. That seems to be the trend. It is worth pointing out that Ukraine continues to suffer from its own manpower problems. Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of strain. From what I've read in terms of reports from the front line and Ukrainian units and whatnot, like they're exhausted. Mm-hmm. And they're not getting enough reinforcements, etc. So, while the Russians are feeling the strain here, the Ukrainians are too. Recent gains notwithstanding, they are hurting. So they do need to figure out some way to resolve that manpower issue if they want to keep going, because things are getting rickety. So yeah, all told, we could be heading towards some kind of turning point in the conflict in the next 6 months to a year, given those trends.
Which would be Russia finding a way for its pride to declare victory as they go through the talks, regardless of whether they make gains or not.
Yeah. Yeah, just giving up on further ambitions and just calling it a victory and agreeing to a ceasefire. But they could just keep going. They could just try to drag it out. Mm-hmm. And the more they drag it out, the closer the Ukrainian army gets to some kind of collapse. We'll see. Mm-hmm. It's up in the air right now. The news has been good for Ukraine recently, but nobody really knows what the overall trajectory of the conflict is going to be. Mm-hmm. So it's all still pretty ambiguous in that regard.
There was also a random question about the plague of data centers in the Midwest of the U.S. Just taking up a lot of area, I guess.
Well, I think the electricity is the bigger issue. They take up a lot of electricity, it pushes up rates, and then people complain. There's also some people who complain about the noise. Some people complain about the water consumption. It's getting to be more and more of a thing. There's more and more political opposition across the political spectrum to more new data center construction. A lot of it is just NIMBYism. A lot of it is just people at a local level complaining about data centers for one reason or another, and then in turn mobilizing local authorities to stop them. Mm-hmm. And it's happening at a greater frequency now than it was before, such that some people are suggesting that this could be something that could be used to mobilize at the national level. If enough people don't like something, invariably, some set of politicians are going to try to run on it. Mm-hmm. So you could well see skepticism of data centers become part of broader American political discourse. And given that it seems to be popular on a bipartisan level, both Democrats and Republicans have been complaining about it, you could see it everywhere soon.
That just warms my heart. Anytime I hear you say something like Democrats and Republicans agreed on something, it's just like a moment for me. I'm like, wow, that's happened? It happened.
Yeah. Yeah, there could be bipartisan support for stopping data center construction.
Chat, you're red, you're blue, you're welcome here. We love you. And don't we all hate data centers?
Yeah, I'm not sure what that's going to augur for the AI bubble.
Yeah. Well, I think
the industry,
people are just throwing a ton of investment in that direction because they feel like computing power and data is the future. So the more we invest in that early, the more that's going to like create gains over time. But the data centers only benefit the owner. It's not something that benefits the community, but all these things you mentioned about noise and taking water and waste and so on, it's not a good deal for the people.
Well, honestly, I can't comment too much on that aspect of it because I haven't really seen empirical data yet. Yeah, I haven't sat down and tried to figure out just how much waste there actually is. Because I've heard a counter argument that even though they consume a lot of water, they end up just pumping it back into the supply. So there's not really a net loss overall. So I want to fact check that. Actually, somebody in chat might know, so I would ask for feedback on that. Electricity usage is definitely an issue, but there's also been expansions to electricity production. A lot of these data centers have started investing in their own energy production, specifically to get around accusations that they're hogging electricity. And I can't really vouch for the noise complaints. I don't know how loud they are. I've never been around one. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how much of a problem that actually is. That could just be a matter of personal taste. Again, NIMBYs just don't like loud new shit in their vicinity in general. So the fact that it makes noise at all could just be the problem for them. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I would want to look at more hard data there before I kind of settled on one side or the other. I'm just saying here that there's a lot more bipartisan support against data centers. That seems to be the trend. Mm.
Yeah, one of the things that has frustrated me is the way that a lot of large soda companies will take local water sources in places like Mexico, and they'll take priority over the people who live there for getting the best drinking water to make their beverages. So this is obviously a different situation, but another one where it's a lot of corporate power versus local people, and how if you have a lot of spending and investment money, you have the ability to kind of plow over existing stuff just because you have that purchasing power, where there's kind of the human right to have property and to keep your land. It's kind of a thing. Sometimes we try to abide.
Yeah, corporations do tend to kind of throw their weight around, especially in developing countries where corruption and administrative capacity are more of an issue, such that politicians are more susceptible to suggestion of one kind or another from foreign corporations. Yeah, water usage is one result of that. They end up using more water than they should, but there's also been issues of, outright political violence that has been de facto sponsored by those companies. I remember way back in the day, Coca-Cola got in trouble. I think it was Coca-Cola got in trouble for some of their subcontractors murdering union activists.
What the hell?
Yeah, I think that was in Colombia, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, lots of right-wing paramilitaries in Colombia willing to play ball in that regard. So I don't doubt they had any shortage of volunteers, but you're not supposed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Suffice to say. Let's see, I had a couple other items on Ukraine here. Specifically on, what is it, drones mostly. Yeah, so what are the comparative advantages of Russian drone warfare versus Ukrainian drone warfare? So what I read is that, in general, broadly speaking, Ukraine has an advantage in drone bombers and an advantage in ground drones. I don't know if you've seen those, but Ukraine has invested in a lot of ground drones, and they use them to carry supplies to the front line. Pretty effective. The Russians, for their part, have an advantage in terms of fiber optic drones. Those, of course, have the advantage of not being jammable because they don't rely on wireless signals. So apparently the Russians have better technology in that regard, or maybe just more of them. The article didn't really specify. Some of the other items here I already discussed. Russia is hobbled by its drone procurement market being dominated and captured by corporate interests. And then I also read, this is kind of a niche thing, Russian drone contractors. These are companies that build, or more accurately assemble, the drones in Russia. Apparently they're not really paid enough. Their compensation comes in the form of payment well after delivery, which is a problem in general because it creates a liquidity issue. You know, if you're not getting paid up front, then you have to source the liquidity that you use to pay for your inputs and whatnot somewhere. So that generally means a loan. But the bigger issue is that there's a lot more inflation in Russia recently. And so the terms of the contract are not adjusted for that. So if you're paid later rather than upfront, that means that the real value of your compensation is actually much lower than it should be because it's been inflated away. Mm. So a lot of contractors in Russia are getting squeezed for those reasons, and it's making it difficult for them to operate. Also, another item here, Elon Musk did cut off access to Starlink for users in eastern Ukraine, specifically the territories occupied by Russia, and apparently that has had a notable impact on the effectiveness of Russian drone operations. So that's another reason that they've had a disadvantage recently.
That's pretty interesting that you have corporate actors that have the ability to impact war outcomes. Not that it's a huge impact, but it's a non-zero impact, and that's a personal decision he can make.
Yeah, well, welcome to our cyberpunk future, Neuro.
Yeah.
You know what? That actually reminds me. I should... I've been playing through a shit ton of RPGs recently, obviously. And one of them on my list was System Shock. Mm. And you just reminded me of it. I should probably play that next. I think I got the enhanced version last Christmas or something like that. It was on sale. It's an old game. You can always get the older ones super cheap. Mm. And I've heard very good things about System Shock. That's been on my to-play list for like 20 years.
Nice.
It'd be nice to finally get around to it.
One that's been kind of making me curious to try it is Red Dead Redemption 2. Because Epic Games is a really big studio. The game is very large, and it would be very fun to kind of roleplay cowboy, immerse in that time period. There aren't that many games in the Wild West. I feel like we have a lot of high fantasy games and a lot of sci-fi games, but Old West is a bit more niche.
Yeah, I think you're right. We haven't had a whole lot of takers. Did you play the first game?
I think I watched a roommate play some of it.
Gotcha.
So no, I'm not super familiar with the franchise. Semi-familiar though.
Cool. Well, that's it for all the major updates. The rest is pretty much just miscellaneous stuff.
Has there been any update on the banter about doing something at Cuba?
Not in the past week, but the Trump administration hasn't really stopped harping about it for like months. Past week notwithstanding, so I assume they've got something planned there that they've been putting off. I imagine we'll see soon. I don't know if they're confident enough in the ceasefire that they've just agreed to just move to Cuba immediately. But I imagine if things calm down for the next month or two, then at that point, they probably will start. And we'll see just what they had in store for Cuba. But yeah, I don't have any updates there.
Gotcha.
Yeah, the focus has very much been on the negotiations with Tehran. Did you get that map I sent you?
Yes.
Yeah, you can see how red all of that western part of the U.S. is. And Nevada in particular just kind of has like a little strip of land that's privately owned. I did have a Greenland update, if you're interested in that.
Sure. What happened there?
So the Trump administration appointed an envoy to go negotiate some kind of agreement with them. And I didn't really have high confidence that was going to go anywhere, but there was some news that was released a couple weeks ago. So apparently, what has been agreed is that the U.S. is going to build 3 new bases in southern Greenland, and that these bases will be built on territory that will be considered sovereign American territory. So this is apparently the compromise. The United States will not annex Greenland, but it will acquire some sovereign territory in Greenland, on which it will build some bases. Still very stupid and unnecessary, but this is what we're doing, apparently.
I see. I did see something, I can't remember if I told you about it, that when the Danes were talking to the U.S. or just talking about the sort of Greenland issue, they mentioned that during the War on Terror, the country that lost the greatest number of troops per capita was Denmark. So
Yeah.
apparently they did help us out with that, and they were reminding us. And it's good to get reminders, because not everyone knows stuff like that. I didn't know that. But I guess there were some countries that backed us up and saw the Taliban and such as a threat worth addressing.
NATO in general was pretty supportive. There was a whole international mission in Afghanistan that was filled out mostly with NATO members. I think more telling is that Denmark helped with Iraq, which was much more controversial. Denmark in general has been pretty willing to side with the United States in its foreign policy ventures since the Cold War ended, anyway, more so than other countries in NATO. So, hence the outrage in Denmark in particular over Trump's comments. They're not really being rewarded much for their loyalty here. Actually, Denmark just had an election. Yeah, the result was a center-left minority government, if memory serves. Not a great result for the establishment, but they'll take it. Yeah.
What is the Danish economy based on now?
Let me think. Denmark. What is Denmark's economy based on? I know it's a modern services economy. I don't think they have a lot of big manufacturing there. Nothing's coming to mind. I'm sure fishing plays a role, but it's a services economy, so it can't be all that important. You know what? I don't think I could think of it off the top of my head. I couldn't tell you. You got me curious now. Yeah, I can't think of any big manufacturers. Like Sweden has some big manufacturers, for example, you know, for contrast, as contrast. But I don't know that Denmark has them. I think they've got no, Lego is that Swedish?
IKEA is Swedish. I don't know about Lego.
IKEA's. Lego is Danish. Okay. So that's going to be a big one. That's a big company.
Yeah, Legos are freaking expensive.
Yeah, really. But I don't think that's big enough to carry Denmark's whole economy, so I'm sure there's other stuff.
Well, the British economy is propped up by Warhammer 40k, so...
Which country?
The UK.
The UK?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the UK is pretty desperate for drivers. Wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, I'm guessing they've got some tech stuff. Pretty much every services economy does. Let's see. Some proven reserves of oil and natural gas. Okay. It's not going to be as much as Norway, though, surely. Danfoss. It's an electronics company. Okay. So they've got some stuff in manufacturing. It's just not as high. It's just not as big ticket as Sweden. Okay. Huh. Yeah, I've never studied Denmark's economy in any depth. Very rarely has come up. It's a very small country. It's only, what, like 6 million people? Yeah, thereabouts. Yeah, as far as like Scandinavian countries, like Sweden is the main one in terms of the size of their economy and population. Like they're the heavyweight. Finland has gotten to be pretty big too, but we can quibble about whether or not that's really Scandinavian.
Yeah.
Norway is like the energy powerhouse. They've got all the oil and natural gas, but I don't think they ever developed much else. Can't think of any like big brand name Norwegian manufacturers. And then Iceland is just small. It's like tourist type stuff. Yeah, Denmark is richer than Iceland, obviously. It's more diverse than Norway. It's got a bigger economy than Finland, I think. But I've just never heard details about it. I do remember learning way too late that its capital was not on its mainland territory. I think I was in college
Oh, it's not?
before I figured that out. No, if you look at a picture of Denmark, like the dominant geographic picture, the dominant geographic feature rather, is that huge ass peninsula, right? The Jutland Peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's some islands or whatever in the Baltic Sea. So when I was younger, I assumed that the capital was on the peninsula, and it's actually not. It wasn't until college that I realized, oh, Copenhagen is actually on one of those islands in the Baltic Sea.
Mm.
Kind of surprised me. Never just questioned it when I was a kid. I just assumed implicitly.
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah, I remember Michael Kukio back in the day was telling me that Denmark had an old law in its books that if you see a Swede on the ice during the winter, you should immediately detain or kill them. Something like that.
What the hell?
Yeah, it's like an old archaic rule from when they were fighting all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Sweden used to be a part of the Danish Empire. They broke away. The Danes continued to claim the territory, and so they kept getting in wars where the Danes would try to reclaim Sweden. And it happened frequently enough that there was issues with apparently Swedish armies trying to cross the frozen ice during winter to get at some of the Danish territory in the Baltic Sea, some of the islands, I guess. I don't remember the details exactly, something to that effect, but it was enough of an issue that they had a law about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that law made much more sense to me when I realized where the capital was.
Mm-hmm.
Those are important islands. That is basically Denmark's core territory. The peninsula is basically just Lebensraum.
Mm-hmm.
Did we have any questions or anything?
We may have had some. Myself as record said that he was taking.
Let's see. I think we had one. Oh, that was the one that you asked me. Okay. So yeah, I think we're good on questions then.
Oops.
Did you see the New York Knicks won the NBA championship?
I did not see that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the first time in 40 years, I think is what I read, that they won it. So good for them.
Yeah. Good job shooting those hoops.
Yeah, I was going to say that that's New York's only basketball team, but that's not actually true anymore. I keep forgetting they have another one.
What's the other one?
The Brooklyn Nets.
Oh, the Nets.
Yeah, they were the New Jersey Nets for a long time, and I still think of them as a New Jersey team, but they actually did relocate to Brooklyn. So they're the Brooklyn Nets now. Yeah, I remember that happened about the same time that the Islanders moved to Brooklyn. The Islanders are a hockey team. That's New York's basically second hockey team. Yeah, they briefly relocated away from Nassau County, which is basically east of New York City on Long Island. And I think they played like a season or two in Brooklyn. And it did not work out. They were not making any money. The arena wasn't really built for them, so they ended up moving back to Nassau County. But yeah, for a while there, Brooklyn was spoiled for choice as far as pro sports teams. You've got me thinking about sports geography now.
Yeah.
So before the New Jersey Nets moved, New York City only had one basketball team, the New York Knicks. I think for several decades, for a very long time. And that was unusual because New York basically had two of every animal, two teams in every major sport, every other major sport anyway, other than basketball. Unless you want to count the New Jersey Nets as being a New York team, which kind of. I think of northern New Jersey as being in the New York City sort of metropolitan area, but the New Yorker I have talked to is very much opposed to considering New Jersey a part of New York.
It's a rivalry. Yeah.
Yes, that
fucking
seem
New
to be a thing
Jersey.
to them.
Yeah.
So I guess it's not a New York team, technically, at least when it was playing in New Jersey.
That sounds like an assessment based in emotion more so than the actual lay of the land.
Yeah, so LA was actually similar vis-a-vis football because Los Angeles did not have a pro football team for like 20 years, something like that, which is wild because that's like the second largest market in the United States. You would think if you were going to have a football team anywhere, it would be there, but no, for 20 years, didn't have any. Pretty wild to think about. I grew up, Neuro, without a football team being in LA. That was just normal for the longest time.
They have the Rams now?
They have the Rams now, and they actually had the Rams before. Did you know that they started in LA?
Oh. Yeah, I remember when I was a kid, they were the St. Louis Rams.
They moved to St. Louis in 1994, something like that. Yeah, before that, they were the Los Angeles Rams. That was actually where they started. They were an expansion team in the 60s, I want to say. And they were LA's main football team for a very long time, the LA Rams. And then the Oakland Raiders moved to LA in the 80s. And so then for a while, they actually had two teams there. They had the Rams and the Raiders. And then in the mid-90s, nobody in the city wanted to fund a new stadium. And so both teams left. The Raiders moved back to Oakland, and the Rams moved to St. Louis and became the St. Louis Rams.
Yeah, Chet's asking, is LA famous for its Rams? Yes, it is. So LA is a very bustling major city, and a lot of people are trying to cross the road, and trucks just keep going. Those would be the Rams.
Honestly, I don't know why they called them the Rams. I'm sure there's some weird esoteric reasoning there.
California's a big state. I'm sure that there are some Rams in there somewhere, but LA's like a beachside desert. And I don't know how much wildlife is still around, at least in LA proper. If you go outside of it, there's a lot of open land, though.
I was wrong, Neuro.
Oh.
So I was trying to look up the background with the name Rams. They did not actually start in LA. They were originally the Cleveland Rams.
Oh.
And that team apparently started in 1936.
Wow.
Apparently they relocated to LA in 1945.
And Cleveland is now the Browns, right?
Yeah. Although there's some weird shenanigans there too. Because the Cleveland Browns were an older team, but then they relocated to Baltimore and became the Baltimore Ravens. So then Cleveland didn't have a team, so the NFL gave them an expansion team, which they decided to call the Cleveland Browns.
Just give us back our team.
Yeah, so they didn't get back any of the players or anything, but the league actually gave them some weird deal where they actually get the historical record of the old Browns. So kind of a symbolic thing, but it was a nice gesture for the fans, I guess.
I see.
Huh. Cleveland Rams. Did not know that. Yeah, there was a bunch of teams, not only in the NFL, but in different leagues in the United States that all relocated to California in the 1950s. It was a popular thing to do. LA was bustling at the time after World War II, so it was a popular market for teams looking for something bigger, basically to make more money. You're going to make more money in LA in the 50s than you will in, like, Hartford or Cleveland or wherever. Or Brooklyn, as the case may be. There was the famous case of the Brooklyn Dodgers relocating to LA, becoming the LA Dodgers. Lots of Brooklyn fans heartbroken about that.
Could see that. Seattle might get their Supersonics back for basketball.
I'd heard that. But did you know that LA has 2 football teams again?
They have the Rams and...
The San Diego Chargers relocated to LA.
Oh, they're the LA Chargers now.
They are.
Huh. San Diego's a pretty nice city.
Yeah.
It's not as bustling as LA, but
yeah.
I think it's better.
Well, I mean, it's basically just a big military base, right?
That's a big part of it.
Kind of like Jacksonville over in Florida. Still can't believe Jacksonville has a pro football team. What a weird choice. Anyway.
Sports.
Well, sports geography.
Yeah.
I think that's still kind of in our wheelhouse here.
Yeah.
If you want a more international bent to that, I could talk about the Continental Hockey League over in Russia. Yeah, Russia's Pro Hockey League was kind of a competitor to the NHL for a while, back when the global economy was doing really good. What, like 20 years ago? In the aughts, basically. Yeah, they were really making a lot of money because oil prices were so high. So they were starting to pull more and more NHL players. But then the big crash happened in 2008, and they haven't really fully recovered since then. Yeah, they've actually got a Chinese team now.
The Russian league has a Chinese team?
Yep.
Huh.
Yeah, I don't think anybody in China really gives a shit about ice hockey, but the Chinese government was hosting the Winter Olympics at one point. I think it was in Beijing. And if you're hosting the Olympics, one of the rules is that your teams basically automatically get in. And so China knew that its hockey team was going to be playing, where otherwise it would not be, because it's not very good. So they wanted them to at least be somewhat competitive. So they had this big drive to develop hockey players and to try to field as good a hockey team in as short a time as they could. And as part of that effort, they ended up asking for and receiving a team in the Continental Hockey League. I think that was Kunlun Red Star. It's a Beijing team. And I think after the Olympics, they continued to play for 5 to 10 years, something like that, and then they moved to Shanghai. So among the various Russian hockey teams in the KHL, one of them is a Shanghai team. Make of that what you will. Makes sense to me. There's always people here in North America talking about expanding some of our big sports leagues, pro sports leagues, overseas. Like, I've always, for as long as I can remember, I've heard people talk about, well, what if we put a football team in London? What if we put a baseball team in this other place, et cetera, et cetera. And they played some exhibition games over there in Europe, but nothing ever comes of it. They've never actually moved forward with an expansion team. I really don't think they will. It's just impractical logistically in a lot of ways. But it makes a lot more sense for teams to emerge there and play in Russian pro hockey teams. So I could envision something like a kind of Russian Super League that encompasses Russia, Europe, and China. That makes more sense to me than, say, North America and then having a team there and in someplace across an ocean. Yeah, for a while, it was looking like the KHL might actually do that, because in addition to the team in China, they also had a couple teams in Eastern Europe. I think they got a couple teams in Finland, Czechia, obviously Ukraine. I think they were doing one in Hungary at one point, if I'm not mistaken. I remember the Finnish team was controversial because the Finnish team was not an expansion team. They actually took a pro hockey team that was already playing in the Finnish Premier League, and they got them to leave that league and then join the KHL. And there were some people who were upset about that. I think it was Jokerit, something like that. It's been too long, I don't quite remember. But yeah, it looked like they were kind of expanding into Europe for a while, and then 2008 happened, 2014 happened, and so, all of that, most of that has been reversed since then. They're not nearly as present there as they used to be. They had a team in Donbass.
I did not know that.
Yeah. It was the Donetsk something or other. I don't remember the team name, but they were playing in Donetsk. Obviously, the war starting in 2014 put an end to that. Wasn't really feasible after that. Was there anything else we wanted to get to here?
I was curious about the situation in Myanmar, if that's still going.
The recent news has not been good for the rebels. The Chinese government started leaning into the government, basically stepping up their material support. So the government now has more air assets, more ammunition, more money, etc. And the mass mobilization effort by the government has resulted in a significant influx of new infantry. And they've also been receiving more support from Russia in the form of advisors and some munitions. So the result of all that is that the government has been on the offensive for the past year, and they've been pushing the rebels back slowly, but they have been taking back territory that they had lost previously. So the rebels are now on the back foot, unfortunately. Probably doesn't help that the US government stopped providing non-lethal aid to the rebels. That was something Washington had been doing under the Biden administration. But now that's basically ended.
What kind of non-lethal aid?
I think it's stuff like food, maybe clothing, just random supplies like that. It's the kind of stuff you don't really think about too much, but is important logistically for an army. You need to keep people fed and clothed and whatnot. Probably medicine too, now that I think about it, but I don't think I've ever read that specifically.
Just thinking, stupidly, isn't non-lethal aid still lethal aid if you get hit from a crate that was dropped from a plane?
Yes, I guess you could argue that. I don't know that that's going to be a big game changer in terms of territorial control, but yes.
Just dropped heavy stuff on them.
Well, more to the point, I'm sure the Myanmar government would argue that even if the aid is non-lethal, it's still helping prolong the civil war by providing aid and comfort to the people that they're fighting. So I imagine that's an adjutant there as far as relations with the United States. But other than that, I haven't heard anything. There's generally very little reporting on Myanmar. And even when things happen, they tend to happen pretty slowly. It's pretty rare for there to be large changes in terms of territorial control.
Is there anything happening with the Sudanese civil war?
As far as I know, they're still fighting in Kordofan. The government won the Battle of Khartoum, finally. Pushed the RSF out of the city, pushed the RSF out of much of northern, eastern, and southern Sudan. So now the RSF is mostly restrained to Darfur and Kordofan. And last I read, the front line was mostly in Kordofan. But I haven't heard any updates since then. I think there was a story in depth about the massacres around El Fahir, or El Fahir, I can't remember how it's pronounced. Basically, it was a city controlled by the government that was under siege by the RSF and was besieged for something like a year and change, for a very long time. And finally, the RSF was able to break the siege and take the city, and then basically massacred much of the civilian population. There was some evidence to that effect early on, but there wasn't anything concrete. But now some journalists have kind of gone in depth, and now there's many more details proving that it did in fact happen. Been pretty quiet other than that. Yeah, most of the drama has been Ukraine and Iran. Lots of conflicts getting crowded out these days. Well, we did have a couple elections. Armenia had an election, and much to my surprise, the incumbent actually won. Yeah, Prime Minister Pashinyan. So he's the guy who led Armenia when they lost the war with Azerbaijan a few years ago. Lots of people in the country blame him for that. And they also blame him for not doing enough to help the refugees from Karabakh. So lots of nationalist sentiment in the country was very much anti-incumbent. And I just kind of assumed implicitly that he would not win the next election. But he actually has. Yeah, part of the issue is that even if people didn't like him because he was in charge during the war, he is still the reformist candidate, and people don't really want to go back to the establishment because those establishment candidates are associated with corruption and backwardsness, and basically the general public doesn't have a lot of confidence in the opposition right now in terms of their ability to actually move the country forward. Pashinyan, whatever his other issues, is at least nominally trying to push the country forward. So he had that going for him, and there's enough people still willing to give him the benefit of the doubt that they voted for him, even in spite of his other flaws. I think I did read that the opposition was also divided and that was a problem for them. I read that if they actually united behind a single candidate, they would have won handily. But they apparently were not willing to do that.
See.
So a minor victory there for the pro-Western crowd in Armenia, because he's also known for wanting to integrate with the European Union. So he has a more pro-Western, Russophobic outlook in foreign policy.
Was the establishment friendly to Russia?
Oh, yeah. Very pro-Russia. And the Russian government had been supporting them in the election. Moscow had wanted those figures to win. Didn't pan out. Pashinyan ended up using it against them, pointing out that they did not want to move forward with integration with the EU, and that was an expression of their desire not to deal with corruption, not to improve the economy, and to just be basically pawns of Moscow. And apparently that resonated with enough people anyway to get him reelected. Oh yeah, one of the things I read is that his party is more popular than he is.
I see.
The man himself has many, many detractors, but the party that he leads and what it stands for still has a lot of pull, apparently. They do have a parliamentarian system. So it wasn't just him running for president, it was his party running. And they were able to pick up enough seats to maintain a majority. Let's see, Ethiopia has elections coming up, but I don't really have any details on it. I know Ahmed is running for re-election. We'll see if he gets it or not. Presumably he'll be re-elected, if only because he's going to rig it in his own favor. His reputation has definitely taken a hit over the past few years. Oh, and Spain has elections coming up. I can't believe Sanchez is still prime minister. He's been in office for years now. He's a socialist candidate that won office after all the drama with the Catalonian independence thing. The Spanish right definitely got the most benefit from that. They were in power for a couple of years after that, but then Sanchez was able to move in and take advantage of infighting. And despite the fact that he himself is relatively unpopular, he has managed to hang on to power by negotiating a whole myriad of these weird coalitions. I think the most recent one involved Catalonian independence figures. And the right itself hasn't really done itself any favors either. You know, they haven't been able to rebuild their popularity. So Sanchez is sort of seen as the least bad candidate, and the result is that he's been in power for like 8 years or something like that. He has not had broad public support for virtually any of it, which is why I'm surprised. You'd think somebody would have pushed him out by now or something, but no, he's managed to hang on. So we'll see if it continues. Oh yeah, I did have a Cuba note here. Let me see. I haven't read this in a couple weeks, so I'm reading through it again real quick. So this was a U.S. general, specifically the U.S. general overseeing forces in Latin America. He actually met with a senior Cuban military official at the border between Cuba and Guantanamo Bay. Pretty wild. I don't think I've ever heard of that happening. So what I have in my notes here is that they just discussed operational matters of one kind or another. Quote unquote, operational security matters. Make of that what you will. They did not deign to specify what was meant by that. Let's see, they also discussed perimeter security assessments, force protection, safety of service members and their families, and operational readiness. Oh, sorry, he didn't discuss that with the Cubans. That was part of what he did while he was at Guantanamo Bay. The discussion with the Cubans was just operational security matters. Sorry for the confusion. But the weird thing for me is that he went out to the perimeter of Guantanamo Bay and met with them there. That seems a really weird choice. So I'm not sure what was going on there. Maybe some shenanigans, maybe trying to build contacts, I don't know. It may link into whatever it is the Trump administration has planned for Cuba in the future. We shall see. But I thought it was worth mentioning. How are we doing on time?
Going for about 2 hours 20.
Gotcha.
And as usual, if it's been a bit slow, we don't need to go the full 3 hours. Up to you.
I don't really have much else that's of great interest here. I guess I should do Turkey. This one's been sitting in my notes for a while.
Let's have it in there.
So President Erdogan is indulging in some shenanigans vis-a-vis the main opposition party, the CHP. So what happened is that there was a dispute within the CHP about leadership, like who actually was the leader of the party. And the courts have given what is suspected to be a biased ruling that has handed leadership of the party to someone who is more favorable to Erdogan. So the previous leadership had been very skeptical of Erdogan and the AKP and were stridently in opposition. This guy that the courts have handed control of the party to is very much more sympathetic to Erdogan. He is Erdogan's preferred leader, so to speak. And so that had a bunch of people in the CHP, as well as just dissidents in Turkey in general, very upset. And so it's generally considered an example of, it's broadly considered an example of the AKP abusing their authority in order to get a favorable court decision and to water down and weaken the main opposition party in Turkey. So there has been much angsting in Turkey over this and some protests. The other Turkey note I had here had to do with Libya. Apparently the Turks have been improving their relations with Haftar, the warlord who controls the Benghazi government in Libya. For those who don't remember, there's basically two governments that control Libya. One of them is based out of Benghazi, the other one is based out of Tripoli. Turkey has traditionally supported the Tripoli government, so I thought it was weird and notable that they were actually reaching out to the Benghazi government. More specifically, they've been supplying the Benghazi government with drones and air defense systems. Oh, sorry, no, that's the Tripoli government. They've been reaching out to the Haftar government in Benghazi over some maritime claims. That's what it was. Basically, the Turkish government had already negotiated a settlement with the Tripoli government that gave some concessions, basically, to Turkey vis-a-vis disputed maritime territory. However, the Benghazi government had not ratified that agreement, and so it has not really gone into law yet. It has not been recognized internationally. So the Turkish government has been playing nice with Haftar in order to try to get him to ratify it so that they can move forward with the exploitation of resources in that disputed territory. Also, Haftar's son apparently has met personally with some Turkish security officials, including the head of Turkey's National Intelligence Organization. And let's see, also he visited, this again is the son, visited Ankara 3 times last year in 2025. And in one of those meetings, he met with the defense minister of Turkey. So well-connected figure here meeting with high-level security officials in Turkey, which suggests that there's some kind of negotiation happening. So I don't think Turkey is going to abandon the Tripoli government outright here, but it seems clear they're trying to build relations with the other government for reasons that have to do with Turkish self-interest. Ideally, they would use whatever political capital they build here to try to push both the Tripoli and Benghazi governments towards a settlement that could yet happen. That might be something they're negotiating in the background. But for now, all we know is that they're trying to get ratification of the maritime deal, and then also meeting with the son of the guy who heads the Benghazi government. So another item here has to do with something somebody in chat asked me a couple months ago, saying that they had heard something about Turkey trying to build relations with Somalia and then asking whether or not it had to do with energy. And I didn't really have an answer at the time because I hadn't really heard about it. But I had some news recently, and when I say recently, I would mean within the past couple months. Somalia announced that it was going to start offshore oil drilling operations. And apparently the company that they have contracted that out to is Turkish. So in retrospect, it seems likely that that was at least part of the motivating factor for why Turkey had stepped up support to the Somali government. I still don't think natural resource extraction is the only reason. More likely to me, I think my original answer was that Erdogan is probably just fishing around, building relations with people so that he can get favors later. So I don't think he necessarily had oil in mind at the start, but probably that ended up being the reward for the support that he provided them at that stage. So goings on with Turkey, a little update there.
You're one of the bigger players in the region.
Yeah, they kind of got marginalized a little bit with the inflation drama. I feel like they kind of dented their foreign policy ambition a little bit. but they've come back pretty strong in the past couple of years. Obviously, the Syria outcome favored them greatly.
Mm-hmm. Chad asks, how many hours do you think the Lebanon ceasefire will last?
Let's say 24.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll give it 24. But it could be longer. It could be that the Iranians don't really think it's worth escalating over Lebanon, and that they continue with the negotiation and ceasefire as is, even in spite of the Israelis breaking it.
What does Egypt had to say in all this?
All of what? The Iran stuff?
Yeah.
Nothing. I haven't heard anything from them, really. They've been very quiet. They're mostly focused on their own shit. The Egyptian economy has been under a lot of pressure over the past 10 years from pretty much any number of crises. Anything that affects grain prices in particular is going to affect Egypt heavily because they do import it in pretty significant numbers. And in addition to that, they also subsidize it. Bread is subsidized in Egypt. So whenever energy prices and or grain prices go up, and generally they go up in unison, the Egyptian budget is pretty heavily impacted, such that if it's prolonged, they end up having to curtail the subsidies. And that generally results in protests against the government, which of course the government doesn't like. Yeah, high energy and food prices were one of the big determinants for the Arab Spring in Egypt, way back in 2011.
So Egypt
So the
doesn't
government has
produce enough food for itself?
It's not that they don't get enough food, it's just that they have to import a lot of it and subsidize it so it's affordable for the population. So it's a major financial strain for them.
I see.
And they don't have enough room in their budget to significantly expend more resources to cover increases in costs that come from higher energy prices and higher grain prices. Mm-hmm. So, if food prices go up like 20%, the Egyptian government cannot afford to increase the subsidies that they would need to in order to keep the prices low in Egypt. So generally, they have to reduce subsidies in that case, which again sets people off. So given that energy prices have been affected by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, I expect they're mostly focused on trying to manage their budget to try to ensure that they don't have to relax subsidies. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're probably getting near the point where they will relax them. Because so long as a disruption only lasts for like a month or two, they're fine. They've got enough reserves to maintain subsidies even then. But eventually they're going to hit a tipping point if it goes on long enough, and then they're screwed. Pretty much guaranteed to have mass protests at that point.
Gotcha. So they have their own problems. They're not really throwing their weight around.
Yeah, Egyptian foreign policy has not been very vocal. Well, I should phrase it like this: the Egyptian government has not been very vocal in its foreign policy in recent years. Pretty much since the Arab Spring happened, they've been mostly focused on internal affairs. They very rarely dipped heavily into the broader region and its drama. Some of that, I suspect, is Saudi influence. The Saudis helped float the Egyptian government for a while after the unrest, and they gave a lot of support to the Egyptian army after they seized control of the country again in that coup in which Sisi seized power. Mm-hmm. So, to my mind, Egyptian foreign policy is kind of subsidiary to broader Gulf foreign policy at this point. Egypt is not entirely independent in that regard. They need the money from the Gulf monarchies too badly to really dissent too much from their line. Mm-hmm.
I was curious also about Japan and how, with the yen being weak, what are the consequences of that for their country? And will that change over time? Because right now, a lot of people are vacationing in Japan because the yen is relatively weak to the dollar.
So it's actually inflationary, because when your currency is weak, then everything you import becomes more expensive. And Japan imports a lot of important stuff. Like, it doesn't produce enough natural resources to power its industry. So oil, for example, has to be mostly imported. Raw materials for steel production imported. A lot of stuff for their manufacturing sector has to be imported. So all of that gets more expensive with the weaker yen. And that in turn cuts into the profit margin of a lot of Japanese firms, including some important big manufacturers. So basically, it squeezes the Japanese economy. However, it also boosts the Japanese economy by making Japanese exports more competitive. So there's a trade-off there. Generally, what the Japanese government tries to do is to prevent the Japanese yen from appreciating too much too quickly. Broadly speaking, people kind of pay too much attention to currency markets. Even if currencies appreciate or depreciate in value, generally prices stabilize around the change. So like, if the Japanese yen depreciates in value, there will be a period of time when you can get stuff cheaper in Japan. But eventually prices will acclimate to the new level. So generally, these kinds of things are short-term arbitrage in nature. With some exceptions, there are industries that will not change in response to forex shifts. So like, a haircut in Honduras is going to be cheap regardless of what happens to the Honduras currency. Because if you're a barber in Honduras, most of your clientele is going to be pretty low income relative to, say, the income in a developed country. So your prices will reflect that, and if you're somebody coming from a developed country, the prices will seem perpetually cheap. So there are similar services in Japan that will probably continue to be cheap in perpetuity if there is depreciation in Japan's currency. But broadly speaking, in terms of Japanese exports, their prices will acclimate to shifts in the currency. So shifts in the currency are not really a problem unless they happen really quickly and are really dramatic in scale. That is really what Japan does when they manipulate their currency. And it's not really considered all that egregious. Generally, the US and other states, like in Europe, are willing to give the Japanese a pass on that particular type of currency manipulation. It's more the type of currency manipulation that's more politically controversial is when a state just perpetually depreciates its currency such that its exporters perpetually have an advantage. Japan hasn't really done that over its history, or at least over its modern history. So the benefit from a depreciated currency, that's not really too big an advantage for Japanese exporters. The Japanese government basically just keeps that at a low level so that there's not too much disruption to the Japanese economy. So in the short term, the impact is going to be somewhat inflationary and, like you say, more tourists, since it's relatively more affordable. Yeah, so long as it's mild, the government won't do too much. But if there is a dramatic downswing, like a big depreciation in a short time, then they would step in with probably interest rate hikes and other supports. They would try to nip that in the bud and try to get the value back in line with historical trend lines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think inflation has actually moderated in Japan. It was high for a while during the COVID recovery years, early 2020s. Seems weird to talk about the early 2020s, but I guess that's accurate. Japan experienced some inflation then, and then it kind of cooled off under the Kishida administration. He was more hawkish on inflation, and so was less interested in trying to continue the Abe stimulus programs. He cut government spending, raised interest rates, and basically did other things to try to control inflation. So it was relatively constrained under his administration. I think it has kind of ticked up more recently for obvious reasons, the Iran drama. But there's also an issue with expectations. Takaichi has kind of hinted that she would want to go back, that she might want to go back to Abe's fiscal expansionism and monetary expansionism. And so that's led markets to kind of price that in, and the result has been somewhat higher inflation. Still not as bad as the early 20s, but it has gotten a little worse. Does that answer the question, or am I just rambling at this point?
No, it does. It's something that it has some advantages, so they're not really incentivized to prioritize changing that. I just thought of it in simple terms of Japan is a developed country. They have high technology and good quality services and quality of life and so on. So I would think that their stuff would be about as expensive as stuff in similarly developed countries, but it's cheaper.
It varies. I mean, overall, if you're coming in as a foreigner in a period where the yen is depreciating, then everything will seem relatively cheap. I think in the past 10 years in particular, the Japanese economy has kind of stagnated enough relative to, say, the US and wages here, that it's gotten much more affordable, relatively speaking, in that specific time frame. But I think there are things like food in Japan that are relatively more expensive because the Japanese have much stronger protections for their agriculture. But their agriculture is also more limited, obviously, because they don't have a lot of arable land. So the result is that there are relatively high prices in Japan because that's seen as necessary in order to maintain what few agricultural producers they have and keep them in business. So I imagine it would still seem relatively cheap right now, just given the changes in prices, but for locals in Japan, it's relatively expensive.
Gotcha.
Are you stuck in a game?
Yeah, I'm in a game at the moment.
Well, I could talk a little bit about Japanese strategy.
Sure.
So one of the reasons that Japan likes to keep the Japanese yen within a fixed band and prefers depreciation over appreciation is that it has an export-driven economy. Specifically, manufacturing companies are sort of the dominant economic actors in Japan. And a lot of Japanese economic policy centers around trying to support them in particular. So if you're a manufacturing exporter, what do you want? You want your goods to be relatively cheaper than the competition. So that means a depreciating currency is more favorable to you. You import a lot of stuff, so that means that an appreciating currency would be better for you in that regard. So between the two, both the companies and the government prefer a depreciating currency because market share is more important than profit margin, right? You can have a very high profit margin, but if you can't compete with foreigners in their own markets and pick up market share, it's not going to matter. Like, you're not going to generate the sales you need to really grow. So they really leaned into making sure their companies were price competitive. And in order to try to deal with the higher costs of inputs, because they're importing stuff, raw resources of one kind or another, the government provided various subsidies, both direct and indirect, to try to cover that cost. So that was how they approached trying to develop their economy, especially after World War II. And it worked really well. Japanese exporters were very competitive, not just because they got state support, because they were genuinely good in a lot of cases. And they eventually became dominant actors in international markets in their own right. But it did cost the government a pretty penny. They did have to provide supports in order to kind of really make that happen, in order to cover the costs of the more expensive imports. And that's a lesser discussed side of the Japanese economic development strategy. Generally, when competing development strategies are talked about, they're talked about in terms of export-oriented and import substitution. And generally, the export-oriented development model focuses on free markets and is seen as more competitive and more friendly to traditional notions of liberal economics. I lose that classical liberal economics. But that tends to kind of belie the degree of state support that companies still had. Like, you can still get a pretty interventionist state, even if that state is trying to use an export-oriented model. And Japan really exemplifies that. South Korea basically did the exact same thing. So that's the sort of East Asian state capitalist model that's proven to be pretty successful when it's been done right. And Japan and South Korea very much have done that. But yeah, that's kind of how that's their perspective on things like interest rates, currency, et cetera. It's all basically just centered around empowering a very narrow cohort of manufacturing, export-oriented companies. And some people, especially economists, have criticized this because the result is that the economy in Japan is somewhat unbalanced because there are disproportionate supports to those specific areas of the economy. Other areas don't receive as much support, attention, and haven't really become as competitive. So like if you work in one of the supported sectors, one of the supported companies, you're more likely to get a good pension, you're more likely to have good job security, etc. Like your work environment is just going to be better. But in contrast, if you do not work in one of those companies, you're less likely to get a pension, working conditions will be worse, you get fewer legal protections, etc. So there is kind of a bifurcated economy in Japan, in places like Japan, where there's like an official supported economy that props up the overall economy and is just overall better to work in and is more successful. And then there's the rest of the economy, which does not receive those same supports and is much less successful. And the problem Japan has is that the competitive part of their economy is kind of shrinking, like the Toyotas, the Hondas, like the big traditional pillars of Japan's economy have been struggling to handle the pressure from globalization. The same as all the other, big companies, manufacturers, and developed economies in general. They've struggled with that, and the result is that they don't really employ nearly as many people, and they don't provide as powerful a cornerstone to the economy as they used to. And because they're still the centerpiece of Japan's economic strategy, you have that same problem with broad swaths of the economy not really having good conditions and not offering good opportunities, but without the offsetting benefit of having very large competitive exporters hiring and employing lots of people. So the trade-off is getting worse over time, and it's not clear how the Japanese government is going to handle that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's overlap too between Japan and Korea, and both having very intense work cultures. So if you are a paid professional in your country, you're overworked beyond the hours of most other countries for what you get paid.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a great deal to be a Japanese salaryman. You're obviously in a better position than if you weren't employed, but it's just so much work for the dollar that it makes you pretty unhappy. And I think for both countries, maybe China as well, it's pretty common culture that if you're a salaried worker, not only do you work during the normal hours, but after you go drink with your boss.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much obligatory. You can't really just be like, oh no, I don't drink. If you want to advance your position, that's how you kind of schmooze and build reputation and create opportunities for yourself. Where in the US, I think that would be considered too much. Like once you clock out, your boss should leave you alone unless you're working a kind of job that's meant to be around the clock.
Yeah. Yeah, I read some interesting firsthand accounts of Japan's economy. The work ethic and work culture is pretty intense, like you say, and it kind of expands beyond just the environment of work. But it's also paced very differently. Like you're expected to be at work and working a lot, but the intensity of that work is not necessarily that great. In fact, a lot of people find themselves fucking around and wasting time. They're basically just there because they have to be, but they don't necessarily have anything to do.
Mm.
So Japanese work culture, in some cases and in some ways, does not deserve its reputation. Like, yeah, you're on the clock a lot, but it's not necessarily really intense. You're not really working yourself to death per se.
Mm-hmm.
And I've
Yeah.
heard some Japanese argue that it's actually more intense in the United States. Because even if we have a different culture around, we don't have to drink with our boss after work, we don't have to be in the office like 12 hours a day, whatever. In the time we do have to work, we kind of do have to be productive.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a much greater risk of losing your job. Because unlike in Japan, we don't have an implicit norm in American workspaces where the worker's job is supposed to be preserved as much as possible. Like in a lot of Japanese companies, especially the ones that are implicitly supported by the government, once you get hired, you're in for good. Like you really have to fuck up pretty bad for them to get rid of you. So you have a lot of job security, not because of any law per se, but because of an informal norm. We don't have that in the US. Like if you get hired in the US, you're not really safe. You're never really safe in the US.
Yeah.
There's always a non-zero chance of you getting shit canned for whatever reason.
Yeah. Well, like layoffs just due to a company that needs to cut its spending is a really normal thing. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you even did bad work. It could just be that your department is being downsized or made irrelevant.
Yeah. Very common.
Yep. I remember that was one thing that Kukio would vent about a lot with the US work culture is there's a lot of energy around making sure people have their butts in their seat and they're chained to their desk. So it gives the appearance of hard work when the assignments on a given day, especially for someone like him who's gifted and talented, he could finish what they ask of him in maybe 3 hours, but then he has to be there for 8, which seems like a form of torture. You're just meant to busy yourself in some way that it looks like you're doing stuff, but it's not completely merit-based where once you're done with your tasks, you can leave. A lot of times they really want you in the office. I'd be curious to see what his take would be after COVID, because I think the culture shifted more toward work from home and being friendly toward that as an option, because it really tested the economy in general of if we all can't go into the office, what can you do from home? And if they realize, okay, your productivity is equal to or greater than you being stuck in the office, so we'll just let you work from home, which also increased remote work too.
Well, there's been a big push to roll that back. A lot of people are getting dragged back into the office. So I don't know if that'll be a lasting change. But yeah, in general, the weight has shifted more towards work from home. I imagine he would have liked that. He did that. You guys did that, didn't you? You were living up in Vancouver?
Yeah, that was the Vancouver move, which I think that was probably his happiest time. Vancouver and then Bremerton. We lived in both of those places, and he was working remotely, and I was doing like poker stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you guys were talking about trying Bangkok at one point.
Yeah, it was just a question of like, what's the cost of living that you're happy with? Like, what kind of living situation do you want versus how much money do you need to support that? Because there are a lot of job opportunities that he took, and he kind of knew this as he was doing it, where they offer him a big pay raise, but that means that he has to do stuff that he doesn't want to do as much, and they take up more of his time. And there's kind of a sweet spot, I think, for every person relative to your ambition and your desired quality of life and how much you want to work, where you've kind of hit that elegant sufficiency where you're getting enough money to live the way that you want, but you're not being overworked at the whims of someone else. Because if you're not trying to shoot for a particular dollar amount and you're not shooting for just always increasing your salary, there could be a point where a person is satisfied and they don't want to kind of sacrifice more of themselves for what the boss wants.
Yeah. I concur.
Yeah. Well, very cool. Good to be back in the saddle after some time off.
Yeah, it's been a while.
I'm working on book 3 in my trilogy that I'm reading, so it's been cool to take things at a different pace. There are some just obvious things about a book that you forget until you use one again. I realized that books, they don't run out of battery, and they're also completely consistent for your ability to read even if you don't have good cell reception or Wi-Fi. You can
Very
open a
handy.
book in the middle of nowhere and you could still use the book. The trick is you do need a light source. It's not self-lighted. So you need either daytime or an external light of some kind. But it was refreshing to me because there's just so much in terms of video games, movies, shows, memes to browse, short form content that you can kind of forget about books. But if you find one that, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, it really captivates your attention, and some of you might doubt me, there are moments where I looked at the book and it was more exciting than the phone. That's it's kind of kicking it old school a little bit. Books don't use battery. It's an infinite battery set of text. Pretty crazy.
Very handy technology.
Yeah.
I like the smell myself.
I like the weight of it. And you also get the progression of turning the pages. So I feel like a Kindle, it still makes me feel like I'm using electronics because you are.
Yeah.
Book is pretty cool and old school.
Good stuff.
Well, very good. Chat, thank you for joining us as usual. Fuzzycore, thank you for handling questions. Agent Smith, thank you for your time. And we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.